The fine was $5. That's what they charged me for sitting on a quiet dock with my daughter, casting a line into the water, trying to remember what peace felt like. The sun was barely up. The lake was calm. And for the first time in weeks, Solon smiled. Then came the voice. You are in violation of HOA policy. Just like that, serenity shattered. Let me ask you this. Where are you watching this from? Is it your bathroom, hiding from your HOA Zoom meeting? Or maybe your car, pulled into a random parking lot so no one hears you scream into your phone at yet another violation letter for unauthorized mailboxes color? If so, buckle up. This isn't just a story about fishing. It's about power, grief, and what happens when the wrong person picks a fight with someone who has nothing left to lose. My name is Remi Thorncroft, and 2 months ago, I moved to Lakeside Estates with one goal: rebuild what was left of my family. See, not that long ago, I was living what the magazines would call the American dream: high-rise office, venture capital firm with my name on the glass, early retirement at 42 after selling stakes in tech startups that now power half the apps on your phone. The kind of life where your email signature gets you into boardrooms and onto panels you didn't even apply for. But success doesn't make you bulletproof. Cancer doesn't care what you built. Rachel, my wife, the one person who always saw through the suits and spreadsheets, died last year, the day she left this world. I watched our daughter Solon fold into herself like a tent collapsing in the rain. I was drowning in silence I couldn't fix. And so we ran, not away from Rachel, but towards something softer, something quieter. That's how we ended up at Lakeside Estates. The brochure called it a sanctuary of modern serenity, 6-acre lake, bike paths, a gazebo straight out of a Hallmark movie, the kind of place that sells you peace with every square foot of neatly trimmed grass. The real estate agent, a woman named Cheryl, said there was an HOA, but it was just the usual stuff: paint color approvals, lawn height rules, Christmas light durations, nothing major. She'd promised. Her voice dipped slightly when she added, though the HOA president, Karen Wellington, is very passionate about preserving community standards. I should have known then. I've dealt with Karens before in the boardroom, on the deal floor, at country club luncheons pretending to care about quarterly dividends, but I never imagined a single woman with a clipboard and designer sneakers could unravel a life so fast. The morning it began, I wasn't thinking about regulations or bylaws. I was watching my daughter unhook a bluegill with a focus I hadn't seen in months. We were on a small wooden dock at the edge of the community lake, surrounded by quiet. Her hair was braided like her mom used to do it. She looked peaceful, alive. Then she appeared, athleisure wear, blonde highlights that said weekly stylist. That haircut, the one that practically demands to speak to the manager. She walked toward us like a mall cop with a god complex, holding a tablet like it was a badge. "Excuse me," she snapped, her voice slicing through the morning. "What exactly do you think you're doing? Fishing, obviously." But I played along. "Good morning," I said, offering my hand. "I'm Remi Thorncroft. My daughter Solon and I just moved in on Sycamore Drive, where fishing is strictly prohibited in the community lake." She interrupted. No handshake, no eye contact. Just the cold tap-tap of nails against glass as she pulled up what I assumed was the digital Bible of HOA regulations. "This is a direct violation. The fine is $5." Solon froze. The joy in her face vanished like steam off the lake. I blinked. "There must be a mistake," I said calmly. "The realtor told us the lake was an amenity. That's why we moved here." Karen's smile was like a snake's yawn. "The regulation was amended last month. All residents were notified. We never received anything. Check your spam folder." The level of disdain in her voice wasn't accidental. It was rehearsed. I glanced at Solon. She was trying not to cry. I could see it. And I knew, in that moment, this wasn't about fishing. It wasn't about hooks or bait or environmental concerns. It was about power, about control, about the fact that she didn't like the way we looked, or the fact that we were new, or the simple truth that someone like her needed to remind people like us that we didn't quite belong. She looked at our little tackle box like it was a crime scene. Not everyone wants to see that while enjoying their coffee, she added, curling her lips slightly. I wanted to say something. I wanted to tell her about Rachel, about how we used to fish together every Sunday. How this wasn't just a hobby, it was a memory trying to stay alive in the body of a girl who lost her mother far too soon. Instead, I said, "We'll pack up." Karen's grin widened. "Victorious. Excellent. I'll make sure the fine is processed. And Mr. Thorncroft, do try to stay informed. We wouldn't want any further misunderstandings." She turned and walked away without another word. The sound of her footsteps on the manicured grass echoing louder than they should have. That's when Solon asked, in a voice that still burns in my memory, "Dad, why was that lady so mean?" I didn't have an answer that made sense to a 14-year-old, so I said the only truth I had in that moment. Some people love rules more than they love people. Sweetheart, back home, after lunch, I barely tasted. I scoured my inbox. Nothing. No email. No regulation update. Not even in spam. That's when I started digging. First, into the HOA, then into Karen, then into the ownership structure of the lake. I wasn't just angry, I was curious. And when someone like me, someone who made a living spotting holes in billion-dollar contracts gets curious, things start unraveling. I discovered that Karen had been HOA president for 8 straight years. I discovered she ran a small real estate firm with a suspicious pattern of property acquisitions. I found social media posts of her hosting parties at the same lake we were fined for disturbing. Wine glasses clinking, laughter echoing, no rules in sight. I also found Merrick Henderson. Merrick is the kind of man you hope lives on your block, a retired attorney with a mind like a scalpel and a memory like a database. When I told him what happened, he didn't even flinch, just said, "Ah, you've met the Queen." He invited me over for coffee that same afternoon. His home smelled like books and civility, over a French press and a stack of documents. He walked me through the real story. The lake, not owned by the HOA. Technically, it was still the property of the original developers, Meridian Development Corporation, leased to the HOA under a 30-year recreational use agreement that was about to expire in 2 months. And that was the crack in the wall. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules, she was laying groundwork. And she had no idea that the man she tried to humiliate on that dock used to buy entire startups just to shut them down before breakfast. What would you do? If someone turned your healing into a fine, would you pay and move on, or would you start asking questions no one ever dared to ask before? Because I had 4 million reasons to fight back, and I was just getting started. The next morning, I didn't go fishing. I went hunting for facts. I dropped Solon off at school and drove straight to the county records office, a place where most residents of lakeside estates likely never set foot unless forced to by a property dispute. The building was cold, utilitarian, the kind of place with fluorescent lights that hum too loudly and chairs that seemed designed to discourage lingering. I told the clerk I was researching the ownership history of the 6-acre lake in our neighborhood. She raised an eyebrow. "You in development?" "No," I said, "just a neighbor with questions." She shrugged and pushed a form across the counter. "Start here." 2 hours and 3 paper cuts later, I held what looked like the forgotten DNA of our community, the original deed. the lease agreement between Meridian Development and the Lakeside Estates, HOA. And most importantly, the expiration clause. It was crystal clear. Unless renewed or renegotiated, the HOA's rights to the lake and its shoreline expired in exactly 53 days. I stood there in the quiet of the archive room and whispered, "Well, Karen, looks like your clock is ticking." But this wasn't a movie. I couldn't just wave a document and expect the villain to vanish. I needed proof. Motive? Allies. Enter Merrick Henderson. Again, that afternoon, I knocked on his door with a folder full of legalese and a face full of resolve. He greeted me with a smile that said, "I was wondering when you'd show up again. Over coffee." French roast this time. Bold and bitter, like the path ahead, I showed him what I'd found. He didn't even blink. "She knows," he said, tapping the lease document. "I'd bet my law degree she's already trying to secure a deal with Meridian." I raised an eyebrow. For the HOA, Merrick gave me a look that could cut steel. For herself, it was an outrageous accusation on paper. But the more I listened to him, the less it sounded like paranoia. He had emails, screenshots, testimonies from neighbors who'd been pressured, fined, even subtly pushed out by Karen's strategic enforcement of obscure rules. Her real estate company, Wellington Properties, had purchased 4 homes in the community in the past 3 years. All foreclosures, all tied to residents who had clashed with the HOA. It wasn't just mismanagement, it was economic warfare. That night, I invited Merrick to dinner. Solon set the table. I cooked salmon, her favorite, trying to recreate a recipe Rachel had perfected, though mine was never quite the same. Over glasses of iced tea, we talked about more than Karen. We talked about communities, systems, and what it means when power is granted without oversight. Solon listened quietly, occasionally asking a question that cut to the heart of it all. Why do people follow someone like her? Merrick's answer was simple: because no one dares to stop her. I couldn't sleep. I sat at my laptop past midnight, pulling up everything I could find on Meridian Development. Their website was stale. Their recent projects were sparse. Their latest financial report showed a dip that looked less like a seasonal downturn and more like a free fall. By 2 a.m., I'd confirmed what Merrick had suspected. Meridian was desperate. They'd over-leveraged on a commercial build downtown that never fully recovered post-pandemic. They were liquidating assets, quietly, discreetly. The lake, an underused, under-monetized plot of land, was listed in internal documents as a non-core green zone, prime for disposition. I wasn't just looking at a pond, I was staring at a chessboard, and Karen was already moving her queen. But I wasn't a pawn. The next few days, I played the long game. At school drop-offs, I made small talk with parents. At the dog park, I asked quiet questions. Most people were cordial. A few were cautious. And some, like James Morris, a retired teacher, seemed ready to talk. "She fined me for having a garden gnome," he said it disrupted neighborhood aesthetic harmony. "I've had that thing since 1997. Maria Gonzalez, a single foster mother, shared that her kids were banned from the pool because they were too loud. Diana Winters, a widow from the east end of the neighborhood, said Karen led a group of board members through her yard for a mosquito audit and issued 5 violations the next day. All isolated incidents until you viewed them as a pattern. Karen wasn't enforcing rules. She was curating residents. The HOA wasn't a system of maintenance. It was a filter. 1 week in, we had our first clandestine meeting. We met in Merrick's sunroom with blinds drawn. There were 6 of us: Merrick, Maria, James, Diana, myself, and a man I hadn't met before, Samuel Washington. Tall, well-dressed, with a kind of measured calm that immediately commands attention. Former bank owner, Merrick told me later, and one of the few residents who had dared to challenge Karen publicly. Samuel didn't waste words. He laid out spreadsheets, timelines, violation records. She targets selectively, he said, and every time the target sells, the buyer is connected to one of 3 LLCs, all of them trace back to her real estate holdings. It was a machine. Enforce, fine, intimidate, acquire, then renovate, relist, and profit, and the lake. That was her endgame, the last piece. Samuel said, the centerpiece. Over the next 10 days, we expanded quietly. Merrick arranged secure messaging. Samuel began tracking sentiment online through neighborhood Facebook groups and Nextdoor threads. I kept monitoring Meridian, and then I found the window. Karen had submitted a letter of intent to purchase the lake through one of her shell companies. The bid, $300,000. Over 18 months. Payment plan. No upfront cash. It was weak, but she had time and no competition. Until now, I made a call to Robert Chen, a real estate broker I used to spar with in a different life. I told him I needed discretion and speed. I want to buy a lake, I said. He laughed. Then I wired $350,000 cash. The offer went to Meridian on a Tuesday. By Friday, I had verbal acceptance, pending environmental review, but I kept quiet. Karen didn't know. Yet, meanwhile, things got worse. Violation letters arrived daily, mailbox color, weed control, a garden hose left on the wrong hook. Solon's bike was cited for improper storage. I installed cameras. One night, I caught a shadow figure photographing my garage at 3:17 a.m. We weren't just being fined, we were being watched. Still, I waited for Karen to hold her next HOA meeting, the one where she would unveil her vision for the lake, waited for her to call for a special assessment to fund improvements. She wanted fanfare, I wanted leverage. And when that meeting came, I sat quietly in the back of the community center, listening as she clicked through a slideshow of lakeside lounges and picnic decks and enhanced recreational atmospheres. Not once did she mention her ownership interest. She called it our lake. Soon, it wouldn't be. As she smiled through her presentation, basking in applause from the same neighbors she had once fined into silence, I leaned back in my chair and thought, you picked the wrong dad to fine, Karen, because this isn't about fishing anymore. It's about taking back the water. By the time the environmental assessment came back clean, I had already rehearsed my move a dozen times. It was a Thursday morning. Solon had just left for school, headphones in, backpack slung over one shoulder, her face a mixture of teen indifference and the kind of quiet fatigue that grief leaves behind like a watermark. I watched her walk to the carpool pickup like I did every day. Part guardian, part strategist, part man, learning late what it means to be a father without a partner. Then I went back inside and signed the papers. The lake was mine. 6 acres of still water, 10 feet of shoreline perimeter on all sides. Full ownership transferred to Thorncroft Holdings LLC, a name I created for the sole purpose of remaining anonymous. The transfer was quiet. No announcements, no press, no dramatic reveal, because timing was everything. Karen, true to her nature, had overplayed her hand just enough. The week prior, she'd launched what she called the Lakeside Renewal Initiative. A glossy pamphlet was stuffed into every mailbox, complete with mock-ups of a private lakefront clubhouse, exclusive use docs, and a reimagined aesthetic experience for legacy homeowners. That wasn't a mistake in wording, it was a message. Newer residents like me, families who didn't fit her silent ideal of HOA perfection, would be locked out physically and socially through access codes, regulation tweaks, and architectural modifications disguised as safety improvements. She planned to use HOA funds to finance a purchase that would ultimately privatize the lake, and no one questioned it. Why would they? Karen Wellington was the queen of optics. She didn't run a homeowners association. She ran a curated illusion. But illusions crack under pressure. You just have to know where to press. I called Merrick and Samuel to my house that evening. We met in my garage, newly lit, freshly insulated, and lined with corkboard walls pinned with documents, diagrams, and timelines. It looked like a startup war room, not a suburban workspace. "Congratulations," Samuel said, reading the deed. "You've just purchased the HOA's heart." "No," I corrected. "I purchased the truth. Now we decide how to reveal it." But there was a problem. According to the original recreational lease, the HOA technically still had lake access for 27 more days. I could not legally restrict usage unless I proved they had violated the lease's conditions. So I dug deeper. Environmental neglect check. I had lab results showing nitrate and phosphate levels high enough to impact fish health, runoff from years of over-fertilized lawns and pesticide-heavy landscaping. Breach of maintenance obligations. Check. The shoreline was eroding in 3 locations. Karen had diverted the maintenance budget last year to upgrade lights in the community tennis courts, another prestige move benefiting fewer than a dozen households. Unauthorized events. I had photos. Karen's birthday bash, complete with fire pits, glass bottles near the water, and a hired DJ on a generator. The lease had a clause specifically banning amplified sound near the lake without written approval from the developer. Strike 3. On Monday morning, my lawyer delivered a notice of immediate lease termination to the HOA's legal counsel, grounds material breach of environmental maintenance and usage clauses, effective immediately. Karen didn't know. Not yet. I waited until Saturday. The party she planned her lakefront victory lap was already in motion. Decorators had set up white tents around the gazebo. Soft jazz played from Bluetooth speakers. And a wine tasting station was positioned where the fishing dock used to be. Children weren't invited. Only foundational homeowners. As she put it, the same group who nodded solemnly when she proposed a $50 a month special lake assessment 3 weeks prior. By noon, there were 60 people in attendance. Karen stood in the center, dressed in navy blue linen, sunglasses perched on her platinum hair, sipping from a long-stem glass as if this was a Napa. I walked in wearing jeans, boots, and a windbreaker zipped halfway. With me were Merrick, Samuel, my attorney, and Officer Dana Reynolds, a local police officer I'd briefed earlier in the week. She wasn't there to arrest anyone, just to observe, and, if needed, enforce trespass law. Karen spotted us instantly and stormed over. "This is a private HOA function," she said, voice clipped, controlled. "Actually," I replied, handing her the termination notice, "you're hosting it on private property." Her smile faltered. "Excuse me," I gestured to my lawyer, who produced the deed. "As of 3 days ago, I own this lake and all land within 10 feet of the shoreline. Your recreational lease was terminated for cause. This gathering is unauthorized. You and everyone here are trespassing." The crowd stilled. Someone laughed nervously. Karen scanned the paperwork like she could burn holes through it. "This is absurd. The HOA has no legal authority over the lake." My lawyer said, "Not since the expiration clause was invoked due to multiple documented violations. The property was privately sold, all legal, all filed, all final." Officer Reynolds stepped forward. "Ma'am," she said to Karen, You'll need to clear the area within 15 minutes. If anyone remains after that, I'll have to issue formal warnings. There was no shouting, no brawl, just disbelief. Wine glasses were set down. Tents were taken down. One by one, residents quietly left, whispering and staring. Karen didn't move. "You don't know what you've done," she said. "Oh," I said, meeting her gaze. "I know exactly what I've done." The next day, she declared war. Violation notices exploded like confetti across our coalition. Diana got fined for a rusted mailbox. Even though hers was brand new, James was cited for non-conforming foliage. Maria's license plate frame was deemed obtrusive. Asolin's friend was reported for unauthorized scooter activity on a common sidewalk. Karen went nuclear. But the more she lashed out, the more obvious her desperation became. And then it happened. Merrick's security cameras caught her and two board members on my property at 1:43 a.m. pouring something into the lake. They claimed it was routine water sampling. The footage showed one of them holding a bottle labeled algaecide concentrate. I didn't speak. I sent the video straight to the police. Trespassing, tampering, environmental contamination. She was arrested 2 days later. The local paper picked it up, then a larger news outlet, then a media blogger who specialized in HOA horror stories. Karen's image cracked fast. A week after her arrest, 3 board members resigned. An emergency vote was held to initiate a financial audit of the HOA's records. Within days, evidence emerged of misappropriated funds payments made to contractors linked to her cousin, invoices inflated by 4%, and a $9,000 landscape enhancement for her private yard labeled as community beautification. Then came the lawsuits. James Morris filed the first, then Diana, then a former board member who admitted she'd been pressured into silence about violations she knew were false. The tipping point came when Sapphira Dusklund, a local florist and board member who had always played neutral, finally stood up at a public meeting. Her voice shook, but her words were thunder. "I stayed quiet for too long. I saw things I shouldn't have ignored. I let fear and convenience make me complicit. But this is our home, not her kingdom." The room erupted. The HOA voted to dissolve its existing board structure and hold fresh elections. Karen was officially removed. That night, I stood by the lake, my lake, and watched the moon ripple across the water. Solon sat beside me, a fishing pole in her lap. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. She caught a bluegill and let it go. Then she said, "Mom would have liked it here." And I knew she was right, because the lake was no longer a battlefield. It was finally what we came for, a place to heal. 2 weeks after the arrest, silence blanketed the neighborhood like fresh snow, soft, deceptive, covering up what still churned beneath. The lake shimmered quietly, almost unaware of the storm it had been at the center of. But I wasn't fooled. Power never disappears. It retreats, regroups, rebrands. Karen Wellington hadn't spoken publicly since the night she was booked for trespassing and environmental tampering. But absence doesn't mean surrender. Rumors trickled in that she was planning to sue, that her cousin, the building inspector who'd suddenly taken a keen interest in my deck's structural compliance, had contacted City Hall, that she was making calls to sympathetic homeowners, spinning herself as a victim of a hostile takeover by outsiders. I was the outsider, a man who'd bought a lake because his daughter cried. It sounded absurd on paper until you lived under the kind of pressure that made fishing feel like rebellion. Still, I didn't react. Not publicly. I focused on consolidation, on rebuilding what she'd corrupted. At our next private gathering, now held at the community library's underused basement room, we rolled out our roadmap for reform. Merrick called it the 3 pillars. First, transparency. All HOA meetings would be publicly recorded and archived. No more hidden amendments. No more private sessions held in Karen's kitchen with wine and whispers. Second, equity. Regulation enforcement would be randomized and audited quarterly. If one person was fined for weeds, 10 homes would be checked the same day. No more weaponized rule books. Third, representation. Board seats would rotate. Term limits. No more iron thrones of tenure. The room filled with nods, not excitement, cautious optimism. I could tell most people were still shell-shocked. For years, HOA governance had been a background noise they tolerated. Now they realized it had become a weaponized system that needed disarming. Then Samuel stood up. "I have a fourth pillar," he said. His voice was steady. Restitution. He opened a folder and passed out documents, a breakdown of Karen's Shell LLCs, their purchase prices, the below-market rates of each acquisition, and side-by-side photos of the homes before and after cosmetic renovations. What looked like legitimate development was, in fact, a cycle of coercion and acquisition. She created distress, Samuel said, then capitalized on the fallout. He proposed a resolution that the HOA formally assist affected families in reopening negotiations for property compensation or support legal action to recover damages. It was bold, some might say utopian, but it wasn't about revenge. It was about closing the wound properly, not just stitching over it and pretending it hadn't festered. We voted unanimously in favor. 2 days later, the news broke wider. A former employee from Wellington Properties came forward to the local media, anonymously, with internal emails showing Karen had used HOA databases to prioritize acquisition targets. She had lists who was late on dues, who had unstable family dynamics, who had children with special needs, all flagged, all considered vulnerable prospects. Public opinion turned fast. Neighbors who once looked at me with suspicion now waved. Some even apologized not in words, but in offerings. Fresh muffins left on my doorstep, a new fishing rod for Solon, delivered anonymously with a note. Let her keep casting. But redemption wasn't what I wanted. I wanted resolution. And I still had one more card to play. Back when I first started digging, I discovered something that even Merrick and Samuel hadn't known. Through my old contacts in private banking, I'd begun quietly acquiring mortgage notes on properties tied to Lakeside National Bank, the same bank Karen had a cozy relationship with. Thanks to her cousin's position there, the bank had been offloading debt to manage its own books. And I took advantage. By the end of the month, Thorncroft Holdings controlled debt on nearly 20% of the community's homes, including Karen's. Legally, this gave me leverage not to evict, not to intimidate, but to negotiate, or, in this case, dismantle. I called for a special community meeting, no HOA agenda, no formal roll call, just neighbors, folding chairs, and truth. We gathered at Rachel's Lake. Yes, I had renamed it quietly, in the county records, in honor of my wife. The new signage hadn't gone up yet. That would come later. But the name was official, and it mattered. Solon helped me set up. She strung up fairy lights, passed out lemonade, and smiled more than she had in months. As residents arrived, older couples, young families, longtime homeowners, they didn't see a tech investor or a man with legal documents. They saw a father, standing where they'd once fished without fear. I stepped forward, held up a single sheet of paper. I'm not here to lead. I said, I'm here to return what was stolen. And then I laid it out. The lake was mine, but it wouldn't be for long. I intended to transfer ownership to a community trust, one that would protect it from privatization forever. I'd already filed the paperwork, but there were conditions. First, The HOA had to be restructured legally. Term limits, open elections, conflict of interest disclosures. Second, past enforcement records would be audited, and any fine found to be discriminatory would be expunged and refunded. Third, I would offer reduced mortgage terms and interest forgiveness to every homeowner under Thorncroft Holdings, except those currently sitting on the HOA board, who would only qualify if they stepped down. Silence, then murmurs, then applause. It wasn't universal. Some remained wary. Some wondered what my angle was. But many most understood. I wasn't holding the neighborhood hostage. I was giving it back to itself. 3 days later, Karen resigned, not publicly. She filed a letter through a third party, citing mental exhaustion and unjust character attacks. Her house went up for sale a week later, but there were no buyers, too much baggage. By the end of the month, a new board had been formed. Safira Duskland was elected president, a florist, a quiet woman with the spine of a lighthouse. She promised reforms, and she kept them. She even renamed the North Side Park after a local boy who died of cancer years earlier, replacing Karen's pet project with something real, the lake, now protected under the Rachel Thorncroft Community Trust, became more than a symbol. It became a gathering point. We installed benches, educational signage. Solon started a youth fishing and conservation club. Their first event drew 20 families. I didn't attend as a leader. I attended as a dad. That afternoon, as I helped untangle a fishing line from a branch and laughed with a kid who reminded me too much of myself at 10, Solon walked over. She had a clipboard, sign-up sheets. "We have enough interest to run weekly sessions," she said. I looked at her, really looked at her. There was a light behind her eyes I hadn't seen in a year, not since before Rachel's last round of chemo, not since before the silence fell between us like fog. "You're good at this," I said. "I learned from watching you fight," she replied. I didn't cry, not there, but I felt something release, like the weight I'd been carrying finally had somewhere to rest. Later, as the sun dipped behind the trees, casting the water in molten gold, I sat on the dock. Rachel and I once dreamed about sharing, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I had bought the lake. I felt like I had returned it, not just to the community, but to us. 3 months passed, then 4. The silence that once smothered lakeside estates was no longer oppressive. It had shifted lighter now. Intentional. People walked slower. Children laughed louder. I'd catch conversations on porches again. See dogs off leashes without fear of violations. And community emails now ended with, "Let us know how we can serve you." Not failure to comply will result in fines, but beneath the surface of peace, the infrastructure of Karen's reign still lingered like mold beneath paint. HOA policies hadn't vanished. They had simply been frozen in place, waiting to be rewritten. That rewriting began the day a man named Greg Hollister stood up during a community feedback session and asked, "What are we actually doing with all the power we just took back?" Greg was a contractor, blue jeans, work boots, arms like tree trunks, and a voice that carried without effort. He wasn't the kind of guy who usually got involved in HOA politics, but that was the point. When ordinary people start asking structural questions, you know culture is shifting. We'd held the session on the lakefront lawn, where the gazebo now stood cleaned, repainted, and repurposed as a shared space for barbecues, tutoring programs, and weekend storytelling hours hosted by Diana Winters. She called it Tales from the Dock, and I never missed one. Not because I like ghost stories, but because Solon volunteered there every week, helping little kids turn flashlights into imaginary monsters. That night, I stood beside Greg and answered his question directly. We're not trying to erase structure. We're trying to disinfect it. Karen didn't create the HOA system. She manipulated it. What we do next decides whether it becomes a tool for service or just a new throne." He nodded, thoughtful. "Then let's make sure it never becomes a throne again." 2 days later, Greg joined the Rules Review Committee, something I never imagined saying about a man who once told me, "I ain't even read my mortgage documents." And he wasn't alone. Retired nurses, high school teachers, single dads, first-time homeowners, they all joined. For the first time, people who lived under the rules were rewriting them, and I stepped back. I declined invitations to join any new committees. I refused when Sapphira asked me to run for vice president of the board. I even turned down a local newspaper's profile request titled "The Man Who Bought a Lake to Fight Injustice," because this was never supposed to be about me. I was just a catalyst. The fire didn't need the match anymore. Still, I wasn't done. There was one final structure left to dismantle, and this one had nothing to do with Karen. It had to do with the system that allowed someone like her to flourish in the first place. Banking. You see, over the past few months, I'd continued acquiring mortgage notes not out of vengeance, but out of strategy. Most residents never knew their home loans had been bundled, sold, and resold to financial firms who viewed them as revenue streams, not families. And many of those notes still carried unfavorable terms, balloon clauses, adjustable rates, prepayment penalties that bordered on predatory. I reached out to Samuel Washington again. We met at his kitchen table, sunlight filtering in through the sheer curtains, jazz playing quietly on the radio. He listened as I laid out the numbers. 27 mortgage notes, spanning across 23 households, total asset value roughly $6, $8 million. I don't want to own these. I said, I want to change what owning them means. Samuel sat back, arms crossed, eyes narrowed in the way only a former banker could manage without speaking. You want to restructure the neighborhood's debt, not all of it. I said, just enough to prove it can be done. We built a pilot program, simple terms, fixed interest, 5% max, no penalties for early payoff, all servicing done locally. With quarterly check-ins, we launched it quietly. Emails sent only to residents whose loans I held. Within the first week, 19 households responded. The relief in those conversations was palpable. One woman cried when I told her her payment would drop by $400 a month. A father of 3 admitted he'd been quietly skipping meals to keep up with his escrow adjustment. None of them had missed payments. None of them were reckless. They were simply surviving in a system designed to keep them one step from collapse. It was humbling, and it was working. I told no reporters, no social media posts, no nonprofit buzzwords, just contracts, conversations, and consistent action. Meanwhile, Karen's world continued to crumble. Her real estate license was officially suspended pending an ethics board investigation. Her home, still unsold, was now listed at 20% below market rate. Her cousin, the city inspector, resigned quietly. Rumor was he took a job in another state. The final blow came not from me, but from a 16-year-old girl with a clipboard and a mission. Solon had turned her youth conservation club into something bigger, the Lakeside Ecology Project. With Sapphira's support and the board's approval, they petitioned the city to designate Rachel's Lake as an urban conservation and learning site, which came with public recognition, small grant funding, and most importantly, a permanent protection clause against commercial development. Karen had wanted to build luxury condos on that shoreline. Now it was protected by law and by children with fishing poles and data charts. The day the designation became official, Solon stood in front of a small crowd at the dock and gave a speech. It wasn't long. It wasn't rehearsed. I used to think grown-ups were the ones who made everything better. she said. But sometimes they just make rules and call it safety. This lake helped me breathe again, and I want it to stay safe, not just for me, but for every kid who forgets how to smile and needs a quiet place to remember. I couldn't speak, not right then, because that's what she was. A quiet place that remembered how to smile. Later that evening, we walked the lake together, just the two of us. No meetings, no plans, just dusk settling around us. Warm and slow. Do you ever miss it? She asked. The life we had before all this. I thought about the boardrooms, the IPO negotiations, the travel, the money, the illusion of control. Sometimes, I said, but only in the way you miss a dream when you wake up. She nodded. I don't miss Mom less here, she said, but I think I miss her more clearly. And that was it. That was everything. The lake shimmered beside us, unbothered and eternal. And I finally understood something. Justice isn't always loud. It doesn't always come in courtrooms or headlines. Sometimes it shows up in the silence after the noise ends in the stillness of water that no longer needs defending. I never imagined I'd find peace at the bottom of a war. But that's the thing about peace. You don't find it, you build it. And sometimes you start with a hook, a rod, and a girl trying to remember her mother's laugh. The first snow of the year dusted lakeside estates like powdered sugar over a forgotten cake. It didn't stick, just teased the rooftops, softened the driveways, left little kids scraping frost off swings with mittened hands. Still, it was enough to remind everyone that seasons had turned, not just in weather, in leadership, in spirit, in the invisible current that moves through a neighborhood when power shifts, then resets. And still, I hadn't stepped inside a board meeting since the transfer of the lake, not because I didn't care, quite the opposite, because I trusted the people running them now. Sapphira kept her promise. The new HOA meetings were open, even live-streamed for residents. Agendas were published in advance. Decisions weren't just announced, they were explained. And perhaps most importantly, dissent was no longer dangerous. In early December, I got a knock at my door. It was Greg Hollister, snow in his beard, clipboard under one arm. Remi, he said, we need you for something. And it's not a committee. I raised an eyebrow. We're organizing a winter celebration. He continued, already knowing my skepticism, but not the HOA kind with wine in plastic cups and jazz no one dances to. We're calling it Rachel's Light. I froze for half a breath. My wife's name had not been spoken in a community setting like that before. And Greg, God bless him, didn't fumble. We want to do it at the lake. He said, bonfire, lanterns, hot cocoa, no speeches, just stories. We figured, since that place became a haven again because of what your family went through, it should shine. 2. I didn't say yes right away, but that night, I found an old box in the attic labeled Rachel, Christmas. Inside were hand-labeled ornaments, a pack of cinnamon sticks she used to tie to ribbon, and a small paper lantern, handmade by Solon in 3rd grade. I sat with that box until midnight, listening to the quiet creak of a settling house and the slow exhale of wind outside my window. By morning, I'd emailed Greg back. I'm in. We met weekly after that. No agenda. No funding from the board, just neighbors pitching in. Maria Gonzalez donated 300 cookies from the bakery she now managed. James Morris offered to play Santa, complete with a suit his late wife had sewn years ago. Diana Winters choreographed a youth performance set to Somewhere Only We Know. And when Solon volunteered to sing the closing verse, I had to leave the room and pretend to check on the lighting cables. December 22nd arrived like something out of a snow globe. The lake glistened under string lights. Handmade paper lanterns bobbed in the water, tethered with transparent twine, and laughter carried like birdsong across the shoreline. No fences, no patrols, just neighbors wandering in knitted hats and mismatched scarves, sipping cider and telling stories. I stood near the dock, wrapped in my old pea coat, hands in pockets, watching Solon move through the crowd like someone born into this version of our life. She wasn't the shadow girl I'd once held while she sobbed about a woman with a tablet. She was a young woman now, strong, grounded, her mother's grace in her shoulders, my stubbornness in her eyes. The fire pit cracked and snapped, surrounded by chairs filled with familiar faces. At some point, Sapphira joined me, offering a small nod. "You know," she said quietly, "in another version of this story, you would have become the next Karen." I smirked. Was that a compliment or a warning? "A compliment," she said, "because you didn't. You walked away from the throne. You built a bridge instead." It hit harder than she meant it to, because deep down, I had feared that I would become what I hated if I stayed too long at the center of it all. That righteous anger would rot into ego. But I had chosen fatherhood over power, and now it was paying dividends that no stock portfolio could match. When Solon stepped up to the microphone just after dusk, the crowd grew still. She wore her mother's old winter coat tailored to fit her now and held a simple lantern in her hands. "I want to tell you all a story," she began, "about a day my dad and I went fishing, and a lady told us we weren't allowed." The crowd chuckled softly. They remembered. "But this story isn't about her," Solon said. "It's about what happened after, about how neighbors started talking to each other, started noticing things, started showing up." She lifted her lantern. "I'm lighting this for the people who showed up, even when it was hard, even when it wasn't their problem, and for the people who couldn't be here but helped us feel seen when we felt invisible." The lake mirrored the light in her hand as she lowered it into the water. Dozens of others followed, one by one, floating lights against a dark surface, tethered not by rope, but by memory and hope and something deeply, stubbornly human. Later that night, when the crowds thinned and the cider cooled and the songs faded into quiet murmurs, Solon and I sat on the dock. No cameras, no noise, just us. "Do you think she would have liked it?" she asked. "Your mom?" I nodded. "She would have cried 3 times and then forced everyone to slow dance." Solon laughed. "The real kind. The kind that comes from the belly." "She'd have hated the cider, though," I added. "Too much clove." "I know." Solon smirked. "I made it that way on purpose." The wind picked up, rustling the surface of the lake, as if Rachel was laughing with us. Or maybe just listening. That was enough. On Christmas morning, I found something outside our door. No name, just a red envelope taped to a small jar of lake water. Inside was a note. "This is not just a neighborhood anymore. It's a story. One that starts with grief, rises with resistance, and settles into something none of us had the courage to imagine until you showed us how. Thank you for the lake. Thank you for the light." It wasn't signed, but I didn't need a name, because this story, like all the best ones, didn't belong to the author anymore. It belonged to everyone who dared to rewrite it. Spring arrived without asking for permission. It just came one morning. The breeze carried warmth instead of warning, and the lake stopped pretending to be steel. Buds emerged on trees like tiny declarations, and the sharp quiet of winter dissolved into birdsong and distant lawnmowers. Lakeside Estates had survived its reckoning, but survival isn't the same as growth. The lake was protected now, officially designated as a conservation and educational site. The HOA had transformed, no longer a machine of quiet domination, but a committee of service boring, transparent, and, for the first time, genuinely democratic. Fines were rare. Meetings ended with potlucks. And the term Karen was spoken only in past tense. Like a bad weather event, people still referenced in cautious tones. But as I stood on the dock one breezy Sunday morning, coffee in hand, I knew there was one story still unwritten, the one about what comes after justice. What does a man do when his daughter stops crying and starts smiling again, when his wife remains gone, but her absence no longer swallows the room? What does he become? I'd been working on something quietly, away from the lake, away from the HOA, even away from Solon's noticing, a new kind of project, born not from defiance, but from something more vulnerable curiosity. One afternoon in January, I had lunch with Samuel Washington at a small bistro downtown. He arrived wearing his usual blazer over sweater combo, always perfectly pressed, and sat down with a manila envelope under his arm. "I know that look," he said before I even ordered. "You're itching." I chuckled. "I'm thinking." "Same thing." With more paperwork, he handed me the envelope. Inside were demographic studies, land usage patterns, zoning exceptions, and projections for green spaces versus housing development ratios across the entire county. What am I looking at? Samuel sipped his tea. A pattern, just like the one we saw with Karen, but bigger, citywide. Quiet manipulation of public land via rezoning committees. The same three developers are scooping up green zones and converting them into mixed-use luxury living, usually by greasing just enough hands in City Hall to skip public oversight. I stared at the papers. "And you want me to—" "What?" "Buy another lake." "No." Samuel smiled. "I want you to buy back the system." It stayed with me. Not the literal idea, though. The thought was deliciously tempting, but the principle. What if the strategy we used in one neighborhood could be scaled? What if community trusts, ethical ownership, and defensive acquisition weren't just bandages but blueprints? That night, I opened a blank document on my laptop. I typed 4 words: the Civic Equity Initiative, and then I started writing. Over the following weeks, I worked from home during the day, then met with Samuel and Merrick after dinner at our favorite library alcove. We studied case law, reviewed public land auctions, drafted grant proposals, and modeled a revolving fund structure that would let us acquire vulnerable parcels before they were privatized. It was nerdy. It was exhausting. It was thrilling. The idea was simple: build a nonprofit mechanism that could buy land, freeze it, and return it to the public under protective charters, kind of like conservation efforts for ecosystems, but applied to civic integrity, schools, parks, historical spaces, and, yes, sometimes, lakes. We quietly assembled a founding board, 2 former city planners, one journalist turned whistleblower, an environmental science professor from the local university, and Solon, though she didn't know it yet. We incorporated in April, applied for nonprofit status in May. By early June, we had our first victory. A neglected community garden in a low-income neighborhood had been slated for demolition. Developers wanted to build high-rise apartments marketed as affordable, though their price tag said otherwise. We filed a motion to delay the sale, brought in local media, presented a counteroffer with full cash funding from the Civic Equity Initiative. We won, not because we outspent the developers, because we out-organized them. At the city council meeting, a teenager named Marcus stood up and said, "That garden is where I learned my mom's favorite flower. She died last year, but when I water her dahlias, I still hear her." They gave us the deed on the spot. Word spread. By midsummer, Our initiative had acquired 2 more lots, a shuttered library branch in a gentrifying neighborhood and an old-school playground long abandoned. Each time, we formed a micro-trust with local families. Each time, we let the community decide what it would become. It wasn't a revolution. It was something quieter, maybe stronger. Meanwhile, back at Lakeside, life unfolded with gentle regularity. Solon turned 15 in June. I took her to a music festival downtown, where she screamed lyrics into summer air and didn't once look back to see if I was keeping up. She was moving forward. One evening in late July, as the sun poured honey over the lake, she found me working on my laptop under the gazebo. "What's that?" she asked, pointing to the screen. "A land trust structure," I said, "for a park the city forgot about." She leaned over my shoulder. "That looks weirdly cool." I smiled. "Want to see something even cooler?" I pulled up the Civic Equity Initiative's website, showed her the photos, the gardens, the playground, Marcus and his dahlias, the map with glowing pins of reclaimed properties. "I put you on the board." I said, "Honorary member, but full vote." Her eyes widened. "Seriously, you're already doing the work." I said, "Might as well own some of it." She looked out at the lake. Thoughtful. "Do you ever think, maybe this is what Mom meant for us to do?" "I don't know," I admitted, "but I think it's what she would have smiled at." The next morning, Solon announced she was starting a campaign called My Spot Matters. She invited teens to submit photos and stories about public spaces they loved. The idea was to gather data, testimonials, and momentum to build a youth map of what belonged to them. Within a week, she had 200 submissions. By the end of the month, she had a grant, and suddenly, what began with a fishing pole and a $500 fine had turned into something unrecognizable, something unstoppable. I watched it all from the sidelines. Deliberately, I gave speeches when asked, signed contracts when needed, but mostly I stayed quiet. I wanted the story to grow without my hands all over it, because this wasn't mine anymore. It was ours. In early September, the mayor, yes, the same mayor who once enabled Karen, announced he would not seek re-election. He cited personal reflection and changing tides in public sentiment, which was political code for the people are awake now. A reporter called me the next day. "We heard rumors you're considering a run," she said. I laughed. "No," I replied, "but I'm definitely helping build the playground the next mayor will campaign from." She laughed too, off the record. "Though, do you ever miss it?" The fight, I thought for a moment. "No," I said, "I don't miss the fight, but I'm addicted to the rebuilding." She paused. That might be the most honest quote I've gotten all year, and maybe it was. Because once you've stared down power and reclaimed something broken, not with rage, but with roots, you realize something profound. Winning isn't the end. Rebuilding is. And sometimes, you don't need a revolution. You just need a lake. And a girl who learned how to smile there again. Autumn arrived like a deep breath after a long speech, cool, deliberate, and reflective. The leaves at Lakeside Estates began their slow shift from viridian to flame, the kind of seasonal transformation that makes you feel like time is both moving forward and folding in on itself. The lake mirrored those changes, its surface scattered with drifting amber leaves, a soft reminder that no matter how still the water seemed, something was always in motion underneath. By October, the Civic Equity Initiative had become more than a concept, it was a structure. We had closed on a 5th property, this one a forgotten city lot wedged between 2 neighborhoods, long dismissed as non-functional green space. To the city, it was liability. To us, it was opportunity. A group of Somali American teens had already begun sketching plans for a skate park and art wall. One of them, a 17-year-old named Rafiq, presented the blueprints with the poise of someone twice his age. He ended his pitch with a simple sentence: "We don't need saving. We just need space." Those 6 words ended up on the front page of the city's weekend feature, "The Teen Who Redrew the City." And that headline changed everything. Donors started calling. Journalists requested interviews. A senator's office reached out to explore collaboration. The thing about momentum is that it doesn't ask if you're ready, it just keeps moving. That same week, I was invited to speak at a statewide planning conference. Keynote slot, black tie dinner. A chance to talk about land, equity, and how one fishing fine had unraveled a whole system of unchecked control. Solon helped me write the speech. She insisted I open with humor. Just don't make it dad humor, she warned. So, I began the talk with, "I used to work in venture capital. Then I bought a lake because a woman named Karen didn't want my daughter to fish. Now I run a land trust and help teenagers build skate parks. Life's weird. Roll with it." It landed. After the speech, I stepped outside for air. Tie loosened. Name tag still clipped awkwardly to my jacket. That's when a man approached me, late 50s. Salt and pepper hair. Eyes that said he'd spent too many years reading contracts under fluorescent light. "You're Remi Thorncroft," he said. "I've been following your work." I nodded. Cautious. "My name's Harold Keyes," he continued. "I'm the director of urban planning for Greystone County. We've got a situation. And frankly, we could use someone who isn't afraid to rattle cages." He handed me a folder. Inside were aerial maps, ownership records, and a project proposal stamped confidential. A 10-acre wetland just outside the city limits, technically county land, historically used by indigenous communities, environmentally sensitive, and now marked for private recreational development. Private. That word again. The same veil used to obscure power grabs. The same excuse Karen had used. The same tactic developers employed when they wanted to turn a playground into a wine bar or a riverbank into a country club. We tried to push back. Harold said, "But the pressure's mounting. There's money behind this. Real, generational money. You interested?" I didn't answer then. I took the folder, read it in my hotel room, cross-referenced every LLC involved. I found a familiar name buried in a legal entity on page 7, Wellington Holdings LLC, Karen. I didn't even think she was in the game anymore. Last I heard, she'd relocated out of state, following a messy fire sale of her properties and a failed attempt to start a real estate consulting business in Arizona. But here she was, slipping back into the system like oil on water, unnoticed, uninvited, and entirely unsurprised. The next morning, I emailed Samuel and Merrick, subject line, "It's her, and she's trying again." We mobilized fast. Unlike Lakeside Estates, Greystone County had no organized resistance. Their HOA structures were looser, more varied, their communities more fragmented, but that also meant fewer barriers to entry. No centralized Karen to battle just her money, hidden inside investment vehicles and camouflage corporations. The wetland wasn't just land, it was sacred. We found records of seasonal ceremonies held there for over a century, oral histories, tribal affiliations, local art that had been inspired by the marsh's seasonal bloom. So we did what had worked before we organized. We met with tribal councils. We spoke with school boards. We knocked on doors of neighbors who'd lived on the edge of the wetland for 40 years and thought no one cared. We launched a digital campaign called Not Yours to Pave. It went viral within a week. And then Solon had an idea. "Everyone's talking about fighting against her," she said. "But what if we built something instead? What if we made a proposal of our own, not just to protect the land, but to use it better. She worked with 2 university students to design a proposal for a community-led ecological education center, part outdoor classroom, part wildlife sanctuary. We presented it to the county board at the same meeting Karen's lawyers had planned to submit her proposal for a private resort. Ours included drawings from local school children. Hers had digital renderings of a champagne bar overlooking an artificial pond. The board didn't even deliberate. They voted 7-0 in favor of our plan. The room erupted. Karen's legal team left without comment. And just like that, we had reclaimed another piece of land from the jaws of privatized indifference, not through lawsuits, not through screaming, but by offering something better, something rooted in service, story, and community. After the vote, Solon found me standing alone in the parking lot, staring at the stars. "You okay?" she asked. I nodded. "I'm just remembering who I used to be." She sat beside me on the curb. "You mean before the lake?" she asked. "No," I said. "Before you." She looked at me, confused. "I used to think I was building empires." I said, "Chasing deals, acquiring leverage. I thought power meant access, control, winning." But then I watched a little girl get punished for holding a fishing rod, and everything I believed about strength fell apart. Solon didn't speak for a moment. Then she leaned her head against my shoulder. "I think Mom knew." She said, "I think she saw this in you before you did." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The wind rustled the leaves across the pavement, dry and free, drifting towards something new. By November, the Civic Equity Initiative had added cultural land trusts to our official charter. We launched a new division focused entirely on reclaiming sites of historical significance endangered by development. Solon was nominated to lead the youth council for the initiative. She accepted, then immediately held a town hall on TikTok Live. Within a month, 2 more counties reached out for guidance. And one evening, in our dining room lit by golden lamps and the smell of spiced cider, I read an op-ed in a national magazine titled "When One Man Bought a Lake." He gave a country a map. I didn't like the title, because this was never about me. It was about what happens when you refuse to accept small abuses as background noise, when you believe a dock can be more than wood and nails, when a girl with a fishing rod teaches her father how to rebuild the world. And as I looked across the table at her, laughing with a group of volunteers planning their next campaign, I realized something more profound than any keynote or headline. Sometimes, the greatest legacy isn't what you build. It's what you leave behind in others who build after you.